welcome to Macros with Mythili, the 18-hour show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. In this edition, we're going to take a hard look at an issue that doesn't look as though it's going to go away soon. Because though it's been less than a month since media reports in the draft National Policy Framework on e-commerce first appeared, mind you, the policy has not been officially released as yet. Such has been the intensity of the subsequent debate that government is reportedly likely to come out with a revised policy document very shortly. So in this edition of Macros with Mythili, we're going to discuss some of the key and particularly contentious provisions of the draft policy and try and come up with suggestions that we hope the drafting committee will consider seriously. What should the contours of the revised draft be? That's the question I'm going to ask our two experts, Abhijit Das, Head WTO at the New Delhi-based think tank Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and T.S. Vishwanath, former colleague at the Economic Times and presently Principal Advisor, APJ SLG Law Offices, New Delhi. Welcome to the show, Abhijit, Vishwanath. Thank you. Let me start with some of the basics. Why do we need a separate law for e-commerce at all? What is it about e-commerce that makes it so different from other brick and mortar business? What is the position in other countries? Very briefly, Abhijit.
Mythili, as all of us would be aware, e-commerce is expanding. It is projected that within a few years in India, the digital economy will be almost 50% of the entire economy. And given those projections, it's important to have a framework within which e-commerce will be undertaken. And that perhaps underscores the need for having a separate law. The present law, rather the different sets of laws which are available in the country, do not adequately or fully regulate different facets of e-commerce, and hence the need for a separate law. Even a country like China is contemplating a standalone comprehensive e-commerce law, and I think that is the way to go ahead.
But Rishi, the fact is that even though e-commerce is expanding, it's still a relatively small proportion of the total commerce in this country. So is the hype that has been generated by this policy a little overdone?
I think while we may want to look at a policy for e-commerce, primarily to look at the huge market that's coming, but I think what we seriously need to have a hard look, Mythili, is the fact that do we need the kind of policy which one sees in discussion in the public space today? And I think some of those issues that we are discussing in the public space is not what I think should be part of India's e-commerce policy.
Okay, so now that both of you agree that we need a separate policy, Abhijit, let me ask you a question. Is that, does the policy really achieve the twin objectives that it sets out? And here, let me quote, it says that it needs to create a facilitative environment for e-commerce, including a fair environment for domestic digital firms, while enabling innovation and access to latest technology, and ensure balance between conflicting interests, especially given India's strengths in services export. Aren't these objectives equally valid for, offline businesses too, brick and mortar businesses?
Yes, these objectives are certainly valid for offline businesses as well. But e-commerce is a different ballgame altogether. Factors such as network effects come into play, which really enhances the importance of access to data. And access to data becomes an entry barrier for new entities. So we need to bear that in mind. And what this policy eventually will seek to achieve is to enhance the digital economy in the country. The domestic players will be incentivized in different ways. Perhaps access to data will become easier. Government might think in terms of giving incentives for storing data within the country. Even the digital data infrastructure might be incentivized. So these are some of the ways in which what the policy seeks to achieve in terms of giving a fillip to domestic innovation, enhancing the domestic content of the digital economy would be achieved.
Vishy, would you agree with Abhijit on that? And what would you think are the particularly contentious clauses in the draft policy? Clearly, Abhijit thinks that data is critical. In fact, I think the paper talks about it as the oil of the new kind of economy. So how critical is data, and does the policy do enough to address the issues that we have on data? And do you agree with the position in the paper?
Well, what one has seen in terms of the position in the public space, frankly, I think it rightly has been put together by a think tank. So I think it's more of a thought document rather than a policy document. In my view, a policy document has to talk about facilitation. It should not talk about, how do you protect interests? This is more of a document which is very good for negotiations, but certainly not something that facilitates business. Let's look at data, for instance. Data, of course, there's this huge thing across the world of data being the new oil, but data is also the new IPR. Okay. For companies. So they now need to protect data because the data that they are collecting is something which they need to use, and they have the right, I think, over the data. Now there could be, of course, as long the government has every right to ensure that the data is not misused. But in terms of how the data has to be used and what is it that can lead to, if any, it can lead to any business benefits, I think that needs to be discussed separately and
so
not the way it has
been discussed. In the new shared economy of the world we're moving towards, you don't believe that data also should be shared?
I certainly don't believe.
Good.
I certainly don't think so. I think that data is something which companies put together because of platforms that they have created, and as long as the customers have given it to them willingly and that they have agreed that that data can be shared, as long as it does not intrude into their private space and it does not compromise a citizen of the country, and it does not in any way compromise the security of the country, the data should certainly be used for analytical modes, which can be used as a business model.
So it's a purely proprietary good, not a public. So. I think, Abhijit, you have a very different view on this, isn't it, as far as data sharing is concerned?
Certainly. There has to be a much more nuanced approach to data. First of all, we need to recognize that where does the data originate from? It originates from my action in the online space. It originates from Vishwanath's or your action in the online space. So is it right to assume or is it right to conclude that since my actions on a particular platform have generated data for that platform, data becomes a proprietary asset of that platform? I think that is something which needs to be questioned, number one. And second, of course, is the fact that data has monetary value. These two things combined do lead to a conclusion that it's wrong to think that since my data which I have given to the platform through my consent, that can be monetized by the platform owner in whatever way he wants. I think we need to have a relook at that. Slightly more nuanced approach would be that when I give consent for use of my data, I must be told for what purpose is that data going to be used. If I know that my data is going to generate huge value for the platform, then am I not entitled to get a monetary compensation?
But typically, Abhijit, nobody reads. I agree to the terms and conditions. Most of us, even the more informed people, just tick. So even if you say that, yes, I need to be informed, does it really make a difference to behavior?
Yes, it would make a difference to behavior if what I'm consenting to is made available in a more understandable fashion, number one. And number two, I'm clearly told for what purpose will my data be used. Then the consent will be more informed, and there could be a better case for the platforms to use the data which is generated by my online activity. And of course, there has to be some monetary compensation to be given. Let's not forget at this juncture that you have the best of technology, you have the most innovative management practices, you come up with a new digital product, but if you do not have access to data on which that digital product will be based, then we should be sure that the new product will not succeed in the market. In Europe, we have seen this. There have been search engines which might have been better than the most dominant search engines, but in no time those search engines got driven out of the market for the very simple reason that they could not work on a huge mass of data which the dominant search engine could. So that underscores the real importance of access to data. If you do not have access to data, that becomes a very significant entry barrier, and we need to bear that in mind. And I think that is something which the draft e-commerce policy has given due recognition to. Tomorrow, it is really we in India who will be one of the biggest generators of data in the world. Should we give up this natural advantage? I would think not.
Mythili, is it the government has done this perhaps, the draft policy suggests this purely because there are these digital giants and you want to protect our domestic players against them. So could that be a reason?
I don't think that we are protecting the domestic players by keeping away this data. See, this data, I mean, I disagree with Abhijit in the area of saying that there needs to be a compensation to people who are generating data. Now, if I again compare it with IPR, the IPR comes out of the head of a few people and you can generate it. But the data that really comes out in an e-commerce platform, I'm not talking about other kinds of platform, but in an e-commerce platform, for instance, is coming from individuals, and there are millions of them. Now, if you start trying to compensate each one of them for that kind of data, it's seriously unworkable. It's just can't be. You just can't work on something like that. I think what we seriously need to look at, and a hard look, as you say in your show, the fact that we need to take a hard look on is how do we ensure that the security and the privacy of customers and people are ensured. The rest we should leave it to business. We should look at facilitating business and not trying to regulate business. Because I think in the current area in the global area, I think we have come to this new mantra of saying protection and trying to stop people. Business from doing work is what will lead to growth and development. I would disagree with that. I don't think the government knows it all. I think it should leave it to business to also try and decide what works for them and what doesn't work for them.
It's time for us to slip into a very short break, but very quickly, Vishy, you gave the example of IPRs. But even in the case of IPRs, particularly in the context of drugs, they are not indefinite. There is a time period beyond which that IPR ceases to operate, as it were. So can one look at data also in that context, like IPRs?
Yes,
you gave the example.
If the same data keeps working, and the same data is being used over and over again, we can say that over a period of maybe 3, 4 years, 5 years, the data should be made public. Okay. But that again I think it's too early for me to say how it can work, but certainly we could look at it. But I think this requires a far more greater discussion and a much broader discussion than a small think tank sitting together and deciding what should be done.
Okay, so I'm afraid it's time for us now to slip into a very short break, but please do stay with us. Vishwanath clearly believes that data is proprietary. Abhijit has a different point of view, but we'll move beyond data and go to the other issues of the draft e-com policy, but after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with Abhijit Das and T.S. Vishwanath on the intricacies, the plus and minuses of the draft e-com policy, which, mind you, as I keep saying, has not been made public yet. And so this is the famous media leaks at work. Abhijit, are domestic companies really at a disadvantage vis-a-vis their overseas competitors, because the latter are able to access FDI and hence offer huge discounts, which the local guys are not able to? So is there a case for making the playing field level? Is it tilted against foreign companies or domestic companies? Both argue that it's tilted against them. As somebody who has no vested interest in either, what is the position? Do you think that it is, tilted against one or the other? And what is the remedy? The remedy suggested in the policy, is that the right way to go?
Let me step back and just one small addition to the data question, which I think is important. In the discussions of task force and think tank, there were many companies operating in India with foreign ownership who were strongly in favor of data localization. Okay, now to answer your question, it's a reality that e-commerce platforms operating in India really have deep pockets by virtue of their transactions, their profits, or their turnover in the developed countries. And because of that, they are really able to offer very deep discounts. They are able to distort the prices. Of course, consumer benefits for the time being. We don't know whether consumer benefit will continue for a longer duration. But to match these deep discounts, the domestic players in turn have to follow suit.
But you don't think the CCI, Competition Commission, will be able to handle predatory pricing?
It's very difficult to judge when it's a situation of predatory pricing and when it is not. Let's bear in mind the important criticism which has appeared in the media is that government should not have a role in determining pricing policies. Now, why that criticism is not fully informed is that in the real goods world, when countries dump, the governments have the flexibility to step in and impose anti-dumping duties to counteract these unfair pricing policies. So why should government not secure for itself the right to prevent distortions from creeping into the online business? I think that is the critical point. Governments must have the right, and they must have policies in place, they must have rules in place whereby if the market is being distorted by unfair trade practices through deep discounting, then government has to step in. Consumer welfare cannot be the final goal. The goal has to be a balance between consumer benefits, consumer welfare on the one hand, and fair play in the marketplace. And this fair play in the marketplace, there is a perspective that this is being distorted on account of deep discounts. And why deep discounts? Because the foreign players have earned their money through operations, through transactions in developed country markets. So I think the draft policy makes a fairly good suggestion of trying to contain or control these deep discounts.
Mythili, do you think government should get into the business of pricing, particularly when you have a competition commission and this entire business about domestic and foreign companies? Aren't these distinctions a little artificial in today's world?
I completely agree with you. I think we already have a competition commission, and to take Abhijit's own example of an anti-dumping authority, the fact is that it's an anti-dumping authority which goes in to decide if there is dumping or not. It is not the government policy which decides if it is not there. The competition commission has been kept there with the idea that it will look into anything where there's predatory pricing or if there is an anti-competitive practice. And I think it's the job of the competition commission, and it is not the job of the larger government policy makers to take up that job. If there are deep pockets which are working there and they're hurting the interests of smaller players, the competition commission should be far more active. And if they don't have enough powers, they need to be given more powers. But certainly, I don't think that the work of the competition commission should be taken over by the government.
And this entire distinction, foreign company, Indian company, after all, we do have a lot of large banks which have majority foreign ownership, and at the same time, management is entirely Indian, and we call them Indian banks. So why, that's the case in the situation of finance, this distinction between foreign companies, Indian companies, is that a little artificial?
It is, because I think especially in the current world, this whole thing of trying to say that an Indian company has to be majority held by an Indian I think we need to take a relook at that argument as well. Because if you want to build multinationals and if you want to build companies which have access to technology, which have access to money, then we should be reasonably open about the ownership as long as they're in India and they are working in the larger interest of the country.
But please, won't you agree that ultimately at the end of the day, we want jobs. So does ownership matter, whether it's owned, this equity is owned by foreigners or Indians? Ultimately, the activity is happening in India. So does it really matter who owns the company?
Oh yes, it matters who owns the company. Let me give you just one example. When Facebook was in the crisis pursuant to this brouhaha over Cambridge Analytics, Mark Zuckerberg was summoned by the US Congress. He was also summoned by the UK Parliament. He could ward off appearing before the UK Parliament for quite some time, but he couldn't do so when it came to...
But he also stonewalled the US Congress.
He stonewalled the US Congress, but he appeared there. Okay. But he couldn't refuse, he could in a way ward off appearing before the UK Parliament. So that I think should underscore the fact that ownership matters. And second reason why ownership really matters...
But when ownership is by institutional investors, you could summon a Mark Zuckerberg, but can you summon a Fidelity, for instance, or a pension fund?
No, you cannot, but that is a very important point which you're raising. Mark Zuckerberg may not be the majority shareholder, but he has a big say in the company, and that is what the draft e-commerce policy is also trying to achieve for e-commerce entities in India. And another reason why ownership matters is in terms of where does the final revenue remain. If the ownership is Indian, the final revenue stays within the country. If the ownership is not Indian, if it's from, let's say, XYZ country, much of it will flow back to the headquarters of the country. So while it may create some jobs over here, if the entire revenue had stayed within our country, it may have been reinvested within the country. So a virtuous cycle can be created. So I do think ownership of a company really matters in the long run.
So I just want to comment, Mythili, in one point. I agree with him that if the company is in India, it would certainly, the money would remain here. So what we seriously need from the government is not to try and see how to regulate prices, but to try and create an ecosystem by which companies also in the e-commerce can stay in India and not have to go out to flourish.
Because India is a land of opportunity. So
Absolutely.
In fact, if there was money to be made...
The policy has to be for creating an ecosystem which helps companies flourish, rather than get into how a business development has to happen or how pricing has to happen. So policy has to be a larger umbrella thing rather than getting into the specifics of business.
There is also fear that this kind of policy will work against FDI flows into the country. Is that fear warranted? Like in the case of the Walmart-Flipkart deal, there's this thing about 16 billion FDI, etc. But how much of the money is going to come into India? So will it really affect FDI? And to what extent will it affect Vishy?
No, but the first thing is I don't think the Flipkart is the money is coming into India. It's going.
So it's not
elsewhere.
FDI at all. So why was there so much a song and dance made about India going to get so much FDI? Is that a misconception?
I think yeah, that was in my view. Yes, it was a bit of a misconception because Flipkart was certainly based in Singapore and not based here. But I think the larger thing of will it take FDI away? Now, I don't think that policies like this will take FDI away. Business eventually takes risks, and that's what is good about business. They would certainly want to come and take risks. They go to far more riskier places than even, and India is certainly not a risky place to put business. It's only the policies which matter. But the fact is that India wants FDI. We can't just depend on domestic industry to try and build a country where you're looking at huge opportunities. When we're looking at FDI, I think what we need to seriously focus on is creating an ecosystem that brings in FDI and merges well with domestic investment so that we can create large firms which create employment here. Let's not get into tactics of how each thing should be happening. I think we should look at the larger strategy, and we should start working on the larger strategy of policy rather than working on how do we do it. And I think that's why I reiterate my earlier point saying that this document, which one hears about in the public forum, is more about a negotiating document rather than a policy document.
Okay, I'd like to draw you in on this, Abhijit, except that I need to move very fast. So since you're the WTO man, I wanted to ask you, another point that this policy makes is that we need this kind of a framework to allow India's negotiation position in order to negotiate successfully at the WTO. But why do we need a separate policy? And there are fears that the WTO negotiations are going to make things even more stringent. How does it really affect our interests?
Mythili, at this juncture, there are no negotiations at the WTO, but there's a very strong push.
Okay.
What this policy document will do is it will delineate the contours within which India can take its position in the current discussions, and if it matures into a negotiation, then in the negotiations. And this document will also very clearly recognize what is in the national interest, what are the chief areas where government puts immense value to, and these will then get reflected in the positions which we take at the WTO discussions and negotiations. I also would like to just mention one important point, the fact which Vishwanath mentioned about facilitative environment, very important point. But let's also recognize that the document, since it's not in public domain, so it may not be well known, the document contains many different ways in which this facilitative environment can be created. For example, listing of companies. Then second would be for incentives for angel investors. Idea is, can the big players within the country be incentivized to invest in e-commerce? And I think that will be quite a path-breaking thing once the document comes out in public domain. So some of the issues which you've mentioned about a facilitative environment, we would see it being reflected in the document already.
But in fact, that document talks about localization of servers. Now, will that facilitate or will it push up costs? That's another issue that has been raised. How important is it that you need to localize your servers in India?
Yeah,
we talked about Mark Zuckerberg, etc. So that
yes, I think localization would certainly help, but you cannot. I would again. I'm not against, as I said, localization of servers or the best endeavor clause to localize the servers. But the moment that becomes the law, I think then there is an issue. The fact is that we need to create an environment by which companies feel it's better to localize your data here and keep it in local servers. But the moment you start saying that I will force you to keep it in India, is when there would be a kind of a backlash, people saying, why do I have to do something like that? That will depend on what is the kind of policy environment and what is the kind of serious localization that we can do, and do we have the capacity to do that? Are we again otherwise going to depend on other countries to help us localize the data and bring in this kind of servers? Now, that's something which we seriously need to talk about, and that's why I'm saying that this requires a far greater discussion in the public domain, and taking more people around so that we know what exactly are we talking about and how is it that we are
in the context of the WTO negotiations, since you also follow WTO, obviously talked about the importance of knowing what our policy stance should be, but China also has in fact very restrictive policies on e-commerce. So don't India and China have a great deal in common as far as the stance as vis-a-vis e-commerce is concerned? Can we not kind of stand up against the big boys, as it were?
Yes, Abhijit, of course, is the expert on WTO, but I do have some points in terms of where he comes from. In terms of when he said that this would help us, I know this policy would help us negotiate better at
because
WTO,
you know where we stand.
Where we stand.
Okay.
But I have a slightly different viewpoint here. Is that what we use as domestic policy need not be what we bind ourselves at the WTO. So we could certainly have slightly nuanced policy for a country which facilitates business, but use a much more stricter stand at the WTO in terms of what we are binding ourselves to, like we have done in the services agreement. If we have agreed to allow only 49% investment in FDI in a particular sector, does not mean in India we can't exceed it to a 74%. We can certainly go and allow it. So I think we need to see, are we using this to bind ourselves, and then we kind of open it up here, or are we really going to use a different negotiating document to say that we'll bind ourselves to something, but we believe that we can experiment with something else in the domestic policy space, and which would allow us to facilitate business.
So we're really running out of time very badly, Abhijit. So I need to address one last issue which is there in the draft policy. The entire focus on trying to promote MSMEs and using this policy also as a means to promote MSMEs, however desirable that might be from the point of view of jobs. Now, is the e-commerce policy the right instrument to promote MSMEs?
If we have the right facilitative environment where MSMEs can get linked to the e-commerce platforms, then certainly e-commerce policy is one instrument for promoting MSMEs.
Okay, you do see it as one more instrument to promote MSMEs.
Yes, we need to promote MSMEs, but it should not be so MSME centric that we make the same mistake we made several years ago of trying to promote MSMEs and not build economies of scale in the country.
And keep them small forever.
And keep them small forever.
Okay. It's certainly been a very interesting discussion, and there's lots more, frankly, to discuss in the draft policy. But maybe we'll come back to this topic once we have a final policy, which the Commerce Ministry says will be very soon. Thank you very much, Abhijit and Vishwanath, for discussing this issue. We try to discuss it as threadbare as possible in the 25 minutes that we have. But I'm sure there's still a lot of questions that you have in your mind. Maybe we'll address them in our next edition whenever we have it. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.